The first person to call them liars was the 911 operator, her voice a flat digital hum of pure disbelief. Dot, it was that sound, that specific tone of professional skepticism, laced with a hint of impatience, that would echo in Sarah's mind for years afterward, long after the paramedics had left and the police had filed their report, a sound more haunting than the hiss that had started it all. She'd replayed it while staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., while stirring oatmeal into a bland paste for her daughter's breakfast, while watching her husband, Mark, retreat into a silence so deep it felt like a different room in their own house. It was the sound of their truth being sanded down into something smooth, palatable, and utterly fictional. A story, something that happens to other, more interesting people on the internet, not to them, not in their small, beige-walled living room in a neighborhood where the most exciting thing that ever happened was a misplaced recycling bin. That night had begun like every other night for the past 5 months. Which is to say, it was a bleary-eyed, soul-aching marathon of exhaustion. The kind of tired that doesn't just live in your bones, it replaces them. It turns your skeleton into something made of lead and glass, both too heavy to move and too fragile to trust. Their daughter, Chloe, was sleeping in 2-hour stretches, if they were lucky. The pediatrician called it a phase. Sarah called it a special kind of torture designed to break new parents into their most raw, primal selves. The house, which they had bought with such hopeful, nesting energy just a year ago, now felt like a too-small ship lost at sea. Every room dim and listing, perpetually adrift in the silent, desperate hours between midnight and dawn. The air in. The nursery was thick with the smell of baby powder, slightly sour milk, and the faint, sweet scent of sleeping infant. A nightlight shaped like a tulip cast a soft pink glow from the socket by the door, just enough to see the rise and fall of Chloe's tiny chest in the crib, a rhythm Sarah had come to watch like a hawk, her own breath sinking to it. A silent prayer of please. Just keep going. Just keep breathing. Mark was asleep in the rocking chair in the corner, his head tilted back at an angle that would guarantee a stiff neck, his mouth slightly open. He was still in his work clothes, a pair of faded jeans and a t-shirt with a paint smear on the shoulder from the deck he'd been trying to stain for 6 weekends straight. He'd insisted on taking the first shift, which meant he'd sat down to rock Chloe back to sleep after her 1 a.m. feeding and had promptly passed out from sheer, unadulterated fatigue. Sarah hadn't had the heart to wake him. She'd just covered him with the crocheted blanket his mother had made and tiptoed out, heading for the kitchen to wash the bottles, her own eyes gritty with lack of sleep. The house was quiet, not a peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and watchful. The hum of the refrigerator seemed too loud. The tick-tock of the cheap IKEA clock on the living room wall was a metronome counting down the seconds until the next cry, the next need, the next demand from a tiny human who owned them completely. Sarah stood at the sink, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water, and she just stared out the black window above the faucet. She couldn't see her reflection, just the void of the backyard and the faint, ghostly outlines of the swing set they'd bought in a fit of optimistic future thinking. She felt hollowed out, a vessel for function, a machine for producing milk and warmth and comfort. She loved Chloe with a ferocity that terrified her, a love that felt like her heart was now living outside her body, vulnerable to every sharp corner and sudden noise in the world. But she missed herself. She missed the woman who used to read novels and get annoyed at slow drivers and think about things other than the color of her baby's poop. She was pulled from this thought by a movement, a shadow, detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the hallway. It was Whiskers. He was a giant of a cat, a hulking 14-pound tuxedo with a white smudge on his nose that looked like he'd dipped it in paint. They'd inherited him with the house, a semi-feral fixture of the property who had deigned to move from the dusty recesses of the garage into the relative comfort of the mudroom once they'd started putting food out. He was not a cuddler. He was a watcher. He'd observe them from across a room with eyes the color of ancient murky moss, his tail giving a slow, thoughtful twitch. He tolerated their presence as a necessary condition of obtaining fancy feast. His affection, if you could call it that, was transactional and brief, a single hard headbutt against a shin when the food bowl was empty. Then he'd retreat back to his chosen perch on top of the washing machine, a king granting a fleeting audience. But lately, since they'd brought Chloe home, his behavior had shifted. He'd started lingering at the threshold of rooms, sitting just outside the circle of light, his gaze fixed not on them, but on the baby. He'd follow Sarah when she carried Chloe from the nursery to the living room, his paws making no sound on the hardwood floors, a silent, furry guardian. He never tried to jump into the crib or the bassinet. He just watched tonight, He was sitting in the hallway, right at the edge of the nursery door, which was cracked open just a few inches. He was utterly still, his ears pricked forward, his whole body oriented toward the room. Sarah dried her hands on a dish towel and walked softly toward him. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "Everything okay?" The cat didn't look at her. His focus was absolute. His tail, usually lazily swishing, was coiled tightly around his feet. Sarah felt a prickle of something. Not alarm, not quite, but a shift in the atmosphere. The heavy, watchful quiet of the house suddenly felt less empty. It felt focused. She pushed the nursery door open a little wider. Mark was still asleep in the chair, his breathing deep and even. Chloe was still asleep in her crib, her little starfish hands splayed up by her head. Everything was as it should be. The pink tulip. Light glowed. The mobile of felt clouds turned in a slow, lazy circle above the crib. And then she heard it. A sound that was wrong. A sound that didn't belong in this room of soft blankets and lullabies. It was a dry, sibilant rustle. Like heavy fabric being dragged across rough wood. It was coming from the far corner of the room, the corner behind the rocking chair, where the shadows were deepest. Piled up against the wall like black velvet. Whiskers let out a sound she had never heard from him before. It wasn't a meow. It wasn't a hiss. It was a low, guttural growl, a vibration that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, a sound of pure, undiluted warning. It was a sound that froze the blood in her veins. Before she could process it, before she could even turn her head to see what was in the corner. Whiskers moved. He was a black and white bolt of lightning. He shot past her legs into the nursery and launched himself not at the corner, but directly into the bars of Chloe's crib. He landed with a soft thud on the railing, his body a tense arched bridge over her sleeping form. He was facing the corner now, his back to Sarah, and his growl intensified, becoming a continuous, terrifying rumble. The rustling in the corner stopped, and then something moved. Something long and thick and sinuous uncoiled itself from the darkness and slid into the dim pink light. It was a snake, a coach whip over 4 feet long, its scales gleaming dully, its head raised, its black, forked, tongue tasting the air that smelled of its prey, of her baby. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was a silent scream, a statue of pure terror. Her mind short-circuited. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. Snakes didn't come into houses, not here, not into a baby's room. This was a nightmare. She was dreaming. She had to be dreaming. The snake began to move forward, a slow, muscular glide across the rug toward the crib. And Whiskers. Whiskers exploded. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself from the crib railing with a yowl that was all fury and no fear. He landed directly on the snake's body, just behind its head, his front claws digging in, his back legs raking and kicking with brutal, efficient violence. The scene was a silent, horrific ballet under the pink light. The coiling, thrashing whip of the snake, the blur of fur and fury that was the cat, the horrible, muffled thuds of bodies hitting the rug. The noise finally woke Mark. He jolted upright, in the rocking chair, disoriented, his eyes wide. "Sarah? What the hell? Snake!" The word finally tore itself from her throat, a raw, shredded thing. She pointed a trembling finger, her body still frozen in the doorway. Mark scrambled out of the chair, his fatherly instincts overriding his confusion. He looked from the violent struggle on the floor to the crib, where Chloe, miraculously, was still sleeping. He grabbed the first thing he could find, the heavy, hardcover copy of What to Expect, the First Year, from the side table. He ran toward the thrashing mass on the floor, but Whiskers needed no help. With one final, powerful bite and a violent shake of his head, the snake went limp. Silence. The only sound was Mark's ragged breathing and the low, continuous growl still rumbling in Whiskers' chest. The cat stood over the dead snake, his fur on end, making him look twice his size. His sides were heaving. A trickle of blood, not his own, matted the fur around his mouth. He looked up at them, his green eyes wild and alien, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, Sarah was afraid of him. Then, the spell broke. Whiskers took a step back from his kill. He turned, leaped gracefully back onto the crib railing, and began to meticulously, fastidiously lick the blood from his paws, as if he'd just done nothing more remarkable than track a little mud onto the clean floor. That's when Chloe finally stirred, letting out a little fussy cry, awakened by the sudden silence or the shift in energy. The sound unlocked Sarah's legs. She rushed to the crib, her hands shaking so badly she could barely pick up her daughter. She clutched Chloe to her chest, feeling the solid, warm weight of her, alive and unharmed. She looked over her baby's head at the dead snake on the floral rug, at the cat calmly cleaning himself, and then at her husband's ashen face. They called 911, their voices overlapping, trembling, trying to explain the impossible. The operator's response was calm, patronizing, and utterly dismissive. "Ma'am, sir, I need you to try to calm down. You're saying a cat killed a snake? Inside the house? What kind of snake?" "A big one. A huge one. In the baby's room." Mark's voice was cracking with adrenaline. "It was a coach whip, I think," Sarah said, her voice a little steadier, trying to cling to facts. "The cat, our cat, he killed it. He saved her." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear the click of a keyboard. "And the baby is unharmed? She wasn't bitten?" "No! The cat got to it first." Another pause. A sigh. It was a quiet sound, but it was louder than their yelling. It was the sound of their story being filed away under I for hysterical. "We'll send a unit and paramedics to check things out," the operator said, her voice devoid of all emotion now. "Please try to remain calm." When the police officer arrived, a young guy with a close-shaven head and a tired expression, he took one look at the dead snake, one look at the placid cat now sitting on the washing machine, and made a note on his pad. The paramedic, a kind-eyed woman, checked Chloe thoroughly, pronouncing her perfectly fine. "Lucky you had a good mouser," the police officer said, a faint, dismissive smile on his face. He poked the snake with his boot. "Must have come in through the pet door looking for water. Happens sometimes." "He didn't just find it," Sarah insisted, her voice tight. "He was waiting. He knew it was there. He positioned himself between the snake and the crib. He attacked it to protect her." The officer nodded, but it was the nod you give to a child telling a tall tale about seeing a dinosaur in the backyard. "Cats have good instincts," he said, a non-answer that dismissed the entire miraculous event. He didn't write that down. He wrote down animal complaint and non-venomous snake removal. After they left, taking the snake's body with them in a biohazard bag, the house was silent again. But the quiet was different now. It was charged. It was bruised. Sarah and Mark stood in their kitchen, not looking at each other. The unspoken words hung in the air between them. Did that really happen? Did we imagine it? Did we, in our sleep-deprived state, somehow create this whole thing? The official response had been so uniformly skeptical, so geared toward explaining it away, that it had seeded a tiny poisonous doubt in their own minds. They were alone with their story. A story no one would ever believe. A story about a snake in the nursery, and a cat who was more of a guardian than a pet. And a night when the universe had sent a razor-sharp lesson wrapped in fur and scales about the fragile line between safety and disaster. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the kitchen in weak gray light. Whiskers jumped down from the washing machine, walked over to his empty food bowl, and looked at them. He gave a single, quiet, matter-of-fact meow. The kind he always gave. The kind that said the transaction was complete. The service had been rendered. Payment was due. And in that moment, Sarah knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her hollowed-out bones, that something had irrevocably begun. A secret pact. A silent understanding between them and this strange, wild creature they shared a home with. They were the only three who knew the truth. They were a team now, bound together by a night of terror and disbelief, living in a world that preferred comfortable lies to incredible truths. You quote, rehear, listening to this. And that means more than you know. In a world that's so quick to dismiss the strange and the miraculous, you're choosing to lean in, to believe in the possibility of something more. If you feel safe in these stories, in this quiet space where we don't explain away the magic, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. It tells me you want more of these tales, more of these moments where love and instinct defy all logic. Thank you for being part of this peaceful, believing world. Now let's go back to that quiet house, where the doubt was just starting to settle in. The days that followed were painted in shades of gray, the color of doubt and exhaustion. It was as if the violent technicolor terror of that night had bled all the vibrancy out of their world, leaving everything muted and hushed. The police were gone, the paramedics were gone, but their skepticism lingered. A ghost that took up residence in the corners of the house, right beside the memory of the snake itself. Sarah found herself staring at the spot on the rug where it had died. Mark had scrubbed it raw with bleach and a kind of frantic anger, but she could still see the shape of it, a phantom stain on the floral pattern. She'd catch herself holding her breath, listening for that dry, rustling sound, her heart hammering against her ribs for no reason at all. The world had proven itself to be a place where monsters could slide silently into a nursery, and the people you called for help would politely suggest you were seeing things. Chloe, blissfully unaware, was the only spot of bright, noisy life in the gray. Her coos and gurgles echoed in the quiet rooms, a stark contrast to the heavy silence that had settled between Sarah and Mark. They moved around each other carefully, like people in a house after a fight, but the fight was with a reality no one else would acknowledge. They didn't talk about it much. What was there to say? Remember that time the cat killed a giant snake and everyone thought we were crazy? It sounded absurd even in their own heads. The story began to feel flimsy. A dream they'd both had and were now too embarrassed to mention. Mark went back to work, but he'd call Sarah 3-4 times a day. He'd ask about Chloe, about her nap, about what she'd eaten. And then, after a pause, he'd say, "Everything else okay?" It was code. Has anything else happened? Has anyone called? Did the police follow up? The answer was always no. The world had moved on. They were stuck in their own private, unbelievable nightmare. And through it all, There was Whiskers. He became the quiet, four-legged axis their world now turned on. His routine, which had once been a simple orbit between the food bowl and the washing machine, changed. It became more deliberate, more intentional. He no longer just watched from a distance. He took up a post. His preferred spot was the hallway, right where he'd been that night. He would sit there for hours, a statuesque sentinel, his body angled toward Chloe's door, which now stayed firmly shut. He wasn't sleeping. His ears were on a constant, subtle swivel, tracking the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards under Sarah's feet, the distant bark of a dog down the street. He was on duty. Sarah started to notice the smaller things, the details she'd been too numb to see before. The way the fur on his back would lie perfectly flat. Then, suddenly prickle for no discernible reason, a tiny seismic event of alertness. The way his whiskers, those long, luxurious filaments that gave him his ridiculously gentle name, would twitch forward, sampling the air for data she couldn't perceive. He was reading the world on a frequency she couldn't access, a constant stream of information about things she couldn't see, smell, or hear. He began to accompany her on her nighttime rituals. When she'd get up for the 2 a.m. feeding, she'd open her bedroom door to find him already there, sitting outside, waiting. He wouldn't come in. He'd just look up at her, his eyes catching the sliver of light from the hallway and glowing like tiny, perceptive moons. He'd follow her to the kitchen, watch her prepare the bottle, and then walk behind her, his tail held high like a banner, back to the nursery. He'd resume his post in the hallway as she went in to feed Chloe, and he'd still be there when she came out 40 minutes later. It was a week after the night when he broke his first rule. Sarah was on the couch, Chloe finally asleep on her chest, the weight of her a warm, comforting anchor. The television was on, some mindless cooking show, the volume low, just for the company of other human voices. She was drifting, caught in that hazy place between sleep and waking, when she felt it, not a sound, a presence. She opened her eyes. Whiskers was there. He wasn't in the hallway, he was in the living room. He'd crossed the invisible boundary he'd always respected, the line that separated his territory from theirs. He was sitting on the rug about 3 feet from the couch, just watching her. No, not her. He was watching Chloe. His gaze was intense, unwavering. It wasn't a predatory look, it was assessment. Guardianship. Sarah held her breath. She didn't move a muscle. She was afraid any movement would send him bolting back to the shadows, breaking this fragile, new spell. He took a step forward. Then another. His movements were silent, fluid. He stopped beside the couch. He was so close she could see the individual white hairs mixed into the black on his chest, see the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing. He looked from Chloe's sleeping form to Sarah's face. And then he did something extraordinary. He slowly, deliberately, closed his eyes and opened them again. A slow blink. It wasn't a sleepy blink. It was languid, purposeful. A signal. Sarah had read about this somewhere. A slow blink was how cats showed trust, how they communicated, that they felt safe, and that they meant no harm. It was a cat's kiss. Tentatively, feeling silly and profoundly moved at the same time, Sarah looked back at him and slowly closed and opened her own eyes. I see you. I mean no harm. Whiskers held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned, his mission apparently accomplished, and walked silently back to his post in the hallway. He sat down, gave one final, thorough lick to his left paw, and resumed his watch. Sarah lay there, Chloe's steady breath on her neck, her own eyes filled with sudden hot tears. It was the first thing that had felt real and true since the snake. That silent exchange, that moment of cross-species understanding, felt more validating than any police report ever could. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? Not because they wanted food or a door opened, but just To be near, to stand watch, it's a humbling thing. It chips away at the lonely idea that we are ever truly alone in our struggles. It's a quiet testament to the fact that loyalty doesn't always bark or wag its tail. Sometimes it just sits in the hallway listening for monsters. The bond, once a transactional arrangement of food for occasional presence, began to deepen into something wordless and profound. Mark felt it too. He came home from work one evening, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a day spent in a world that thought his family was delusional. He dropped his keys in the bowl with a clatter and sighed. Whiskers, from his hallway post, turned his head and looked at him. Mark walked over and, instead of heading into the living room, he just sat down on the floor, right there in the hallway, his back against the wall. He didn't reach out to pet the cat. He just sat, sharing the space. Whiskers watched him for a minute. Then he turned his body slightly, ever so slightly, so that his flank was a little closer to Mark. It wasn't an invitation to touch. It was an acknowledgement. I see you're here. I'm here too. They sat like that for 10 minutes, man and cat, in a silence that was no longer heavy, but companionable. A shared vigil. The small behaviors became their new language. The slow blinks exchanged across a room. The way Whiskers would appear moments before Chloe would wake up from a nap, as if he'd sensed the shift in her sleep cycle. The way he'd, sometimes after a particularly tense day where the ghost of the snake felt especially close, leave a small gift by his food bowl, not a dead animal, a offering of a different kind, a perfect crimson leaf he must have snatched from the porch, a twist tie from a loaf of bread that had fallen on the floor, a bottle cap. They were tiny, meaningless things to anyone else, but to Sarah and Mark they felt like tokens, receipts, proof that the connection was real, even if its origin story was one they could never tell. The afternoons were the hardest. The long, slow drag of time between lunch and dinner, when the light was flat and the house felt too big. Sarah would put Chloe in her baby carrier and walk the halls, whispering stories to her, pointing out pictures on the walls. Whiskers would follow them, a silent participant in the tour, sometimes darting ahead to wait for them around a corner. His tail twitching in a game only he understood. One such afternoon, Sarah stopped in front of the closed nursery door. She hadn't been able to bring herself to spend much time in there since that night. The room felt tainted. She rested her hand on the doorknob, her forehead against the cool wood. Chloe babbled on her chest. Behind her, she felt Whiskers brush against her legs. Not a hard headbutt for food, a gentle, fleeting pressure. A nudge. She took a deep breath and turned the knob. The room was exactly as they'd left it. The pink tulip light was off. The mobile was still. The bleach scrubbed. Patch on the rug seemed to glare up at her. The air was still and carried the faint, sweet smell of the baby, but underneath it Sarah could still smell the bleach, and her imagination supplied the coppery tang of blood. She walked in slowly, her heart starting to pound again. Whiskers followed her, but he didn't go to his spot on the crib railing. He walked over to the corner. The corner. He sniffed the baseboard where the baseboard met the wall, his body tense. He looked back at her, then back at the wall. He let out a low, almost inaudible "Morrow?" A question. Sarah's blood ran cold. Was there something there? A hole? An entry? Point they'd missed? She knelt down, shifting Chloe to her hip, and peered at the spot. There was nothing. Just a tiny crack in the drywall, no bigger than a fingernail. It was nothing. It had always been there. But Whiskers was insistent. He pawed gently at the spot, then looked at her again, his green eyes serious. He wasn't seeing a crack. He was remembering the monster that had come from the darkness. He was showing her. He was saying, "This is where it was. This is the place I guard." It was in that moment, kneeling on the floor of the nursery she feared with her daughter in her arms and this strange, solemn animal showing her the scene of the crime, that the last of her doubt evaporated. It was replaced by a staggering, terrifying wave of gratitude. This creature, this aloof, transaction-oriented housemate, had not just acted on instinct. He had understood the threat. He had mapped it, and he was committed to ensuring it never happened again. He had appointed himself the guardian of this room, of this child. His job was not done. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling. She didn't reach for the crack in the wall. She reached for him. Her hand hovered in the air just above his head, an invitation. For weeks, any attempt to pet him outside of a food-related headbutt had been met with a deft dodge, a flick of the tail, a retreat. He tolerated affection. He did not seek it. But now, in the quiet of the nursery, he looked at her hovering hand. He looked at her face, streaked with tears she hadn't even felt coming. He looked at the baby on her hip. He leaned forward, ever so slightly, and pressed the top of his head into her palm. It wasn't the hard, demanding headbutt for food. It was soft, a concession, a silent acceptance of a pact she hadn't even known they were making. His fur was impossibly soft and warm. He allowed the contact for 3 seconds. 4. She felt the rumble start in his chest before she heard it, a deep, resonant purr that vibrated through her hand and up her arm, a sound of pure, uncomplicated contentment. A sound of trust. Then, as if the moment had become too much, too vulnerable, he pulled away. He gave himself a quick shake, turned, and walked out of the room with his usual dignified air, leaving her kneeling on the floor, her palms still tingling, with the ghost of his warmth, the sound of his purr echoing in the silent, sacred space of the nursery. The fear was gone. The room was just a room again, and they were not alone in it. Not anymore. The trust, once given, changed everything. It was like a key turning in a lock they hadn't even known was there, opening a door to a quieter, softer version of their lives. The gray haze of doubt didn't so much lift as it was slowly pushed back by the small, daily rhythms of this new, three-creature family. Mornings were no longer just about survival. They had a pattern. Mark would get up first, and before he started the coffee, he'd scoop a portion of wet food into Whisker's bowl. The cat would emerge from wherever he'd been sleeping, sometimes the hallway, sometimes now, miraculously, the foot of their bed, and he'd give Mark a slow blink of greeting before dipping his head to eat. It was a ritual, a quiet, mutual acknowledgement to start the day. Sarah found she could breathe easier. The phantom rustling in the walls had faded, replaced by the real, comforting sounds of their home, the percolating coffee maker, Mark's off-key humming as he dressed for work, Chloe's morning babble. The nursery lost its sinister charge. She could go in there now without her heart trying to claw its way up her throat. She'd even started leaving the door open again, a small but significant act of reclamation. Whiskers approved. His post in the hallway remained, but now he'd often be found just inside the room, sitting regally on the rug, overseeing nap time like a furry, benevolent supervisor. It was during one of these naps, about 3 weeks after the night, that Sarah noticed the first one. She was tidying up the living room, picking up discarded burp cloths and stacking parenting manuals that had been left open on the arm of the couch. As she bent to straighten the rug, she saw it. Lying directly in the center of the coffee table, placed with an almost deliberate precision, was a feather. It wasn't just any feather. It was a small, perfect, cobalt blue jay feather, the color, so vibrant it looked like a piece of fallen sky against the pale wood of the table. She picked it up, turning it over in her fingers. It was pristine, unbroken. How had it gotten there? The windows were closed. She hadn't been outside. Mark had left hours ago. She looked over at Whiskers, who was sitting in his usual spot in the hallway, fastidiously cleaning one white paw. He paused, met her gaze for a fraction of a second, and then went back to his task, as if the appearance of a perfect blue feather on the coffee table was the most normal thing in the world. She smiled. It was a sweet, random occurrence. Maybe it had been stuck to someone's shoe. She tucked it into the frame of the mirror by the front door, a little spot of unexpected beauty. She didn't think much more of it. 2 days later, there was another one. This time, it was on the kitchen counter next to the sink. A long, slender, brown and white striped feather from a hawk or maybe an owl. It had a fierce, wild elegance to it. Again, it was placed neatly, parallel to the edge of the counter. Again, there was no logical explanation. Whiskers was indoors. The doors and windows were shut. A tiny, curious thread began to weave itself through Sarah's mind. She found herself watching him more closely. His routine had expanded. He still kept his vigilant watch over the house, especially the nursery, but now he'd also make daily patrols. He'd sit for long periods on the back of the couch, staring out the living room window at the bird feeder in the yard, his tail tip giving the faintest, most controlled twitch. He'd then hop down, disappear into the mudroom where his pet door was, and be gone for 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. He always returned looking purposeful. Not like he'd been on a hunt. He never brought back mice or birds, but like he'd been on an errand. The gifts, for that's what she had started to think of them, became a pattern. It was never consistent. Sometimes 3 days would pass with nothing. Then, she'd walk into the bathroom and find a smooth gray river stone sitting in the middle of the bath mat. Another time, it was a single, velvety yellow dandelion head, perfectly intact, placed on the seat of the rocking chair in the nursery. She showed them to Mark. He'd pick up the objects, turn them over in his work-roughened hands, a small frown of concentration on his face. Weird, he'd say, but it was a different kind of weird than the snake. This was a gentle weird, a curious weird. Maybe he's bringing them in through the pet door. But he doesn't play with them, Sarah pointed out. He doesn't bat them around. He just places them, like he's putting them on display. Mark had no answer for that. He'd just shake his head and smile, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in weeks. He's a strange dude, he'd say, and the way he said it was filled with affection. The gifts became their new secret, a mystery that belonged only to them, a counter-narrative to the one no one had believed. This was proof, in a way, that Whiskers was operating on a level they couldn't fully understand. He wasn't just a pet, he was a participant. The emotional weight of the objects was immense. To Sarah, each one felt like a message. The feathers felt like a reminder of the world outside, a world of beauty and freedom that still existed beyond the four walls of baby exhaustion and forgotten trauma. The riverstone felt solid, grounding, a totem of strength. The dandelion was a burst of fragile, hopeful joy. She started a small collection of them on her dresser, arranging them in a shallow ceramic bowl. It looked like a museum exhibit of found treasures, an art installation by a cat. She began to talk to him about them. That blue feather was a good one, she'd say as she filled his food bowl. He'd look at the food, then up at her, and blink slowly. She felt like he understood, that this was their language, a silent exchange of gratitude and reassurance. I am here. I am watching. And here is a piece of the world for you. But then, the pattern shifted. The gifts changed. The first one that felt different was the shard of glass. It was a piece of a brown beer bottle, the edges worn smooth by time and weather so it wasn't dangerous. But it was glass. It was on the floor by the front door, catching the morning light. It made Sarah's breath catch. It wasn't beautiful. It was a piece of litter, of something broken. Was it a mistake? Had he just found it interesting? A few days later, he brought a twist of rusty barbed wire. It was small, only a few inches long, but the barbs were sharp, menacing. Sarah had gasped when she saw it, quickly scooping it up with a paper towel and throwing it away, her heart pounding. What did this mean? Was this a warning? a symbol of something dangerous. Was he trying to tell them about a threat? The peaceful mystery began to curdle into a low, simmering anxiety. The gifts no longer felt like sweet offerings. They felt like clues, ominous ones. Whisker's behavior shifted, too. His patrols outside became longer. He'd leave for 2, 3 hours at a time, often during the heat of the day, which was unusual for a cat. And when he'd return, he wouldn't immediately come inside. He'd sit on the porch for a while, staring into the woods that bordered their backyard, his body tense, his ears flat against his head. He'd come in smelling of dust and dry leaves, and he'd drink deeply from his water bowl, his sides heaving as if he'd been running. He started sleeping less. His vigilance dialed up to a new intensity. He'd be dozing on the rug one moment, and the next, his head would snap up, his eyes wide, fixed on nothing. He'd stare at a blank wall for minutes on end, his whole body rigid, as if he could hear something moving inside it. It put Sarah on edge all over again. The old fear, the feeling that their safe little ship was about to be breached, began to seep back under the doors. One afternoon, she was in the kitchen making Chloe a bottle. Whiskers was on the windowsill over the sink, staring out. Suddenly, his entire body went stiff. A low growl started in his chest, so deep it was almost a vibration. It was the same growl, the snake growl. Sarah froze, the formula scoop hovering over the bottle.
"Whiskers," she whispered. "What is it, buddy?"
He didn't look at her. His gaze was laser-focused on something in the backyard. His tail puffed up to twice its size. He dropped into a low crouch on the sill, his ears pinned back, a predator's stance. Sarah's blood ran cold. She followed his line of sight, her eyes scanning the tree line, the swing set, the garden. Nothing. There was nothing there. But he saw it, or heard it, or smelled it. He launched himself off the windowsill, a black and white streak of fury, and bolted through his pet door into the mudroom and out into the yard. Sarah rushed to the window, clutching Chloe closer. She saw him race across the lawn toward the thicket of woods at the back of their property. He disappeared into the shadows under the trees, without a backward glance. He didn't come back for his dinner. The sun set, painting the sky in oranges and purples, and the bowl of fancy feast sat untouched. Sarah tried to tell herself he was just on a long patrol, that he'd come back when he was ready. But the knot in her stomach tightened. This was different. His departure had been charged with a specific, targeted fury. Darkness fell. Mark came home and she told him, her voice tight with a worry she couldn't fully explain. He just took off. He was so upset. He hasn't come back. Mark tried to be rational. He's a cat, Sarah. They do that. He's probably treed a squirrel and is waiting it out. He'll be back by morning. But morning came and the food bowl was still full. The house felt unbearably empty and silent without his quiet presence. The hallway was just a hallway. The nursery door, standing open, felt like a vulnerable, gaping mouth. The small collection of treasures on her dresser looked like what they were, dead feathers and rocks. Meaningless without the creature who had foo-youed them meaning. Sarah's worry bloomed into full-blown fear. It wasn't just the fear of losing him, though that was a sharp, physical ache in her chest. It was the fear of what his absence meant. His vigilance had been their security system. His strange gifts, their reassurance. Without him, the walls of the house felt thin again. The world outside felt full of unseen threats. The ghost of the snake rustled in the corners of her mind. Do you think they know? Do you think they know when we need them most? Or is it just a cruel twist of fate that the moment you realize how deeply you rely on a creature's presence is the exact moment it chooses to vanish? The second night fell. Still no Whiskers. Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house, straining to hear the soft thump of him coming through the pet door, the quiet pad of his paws on the mudroom floor. She heard nothing but the wind picking up outside, sighing through the trees and the frantic beating of her own heart. She must have drifted off near dawn because the sound that woke her was real. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her heart. It was a sound from the mudroom, a soft, shuffling scrape, then a faint, pathetic, and utterly exhausted meow. She was out of bed in an instant, not even grabbing her robe, flying down the dark hallway toward the mudroom. She fumbled for the light switch, her heart in her throat. The fluorescent bulb flickered on, casting a harsh white light over the small tile room. Whiskers was there. He was lying on his side by his water bowl. He was covered in dirt, his beautiful tuxedo fur matted with mud and what looked like cobwebs. One of his ears had a fresh, small tear at the tip, and he was panting lightly, his sides moving in and out too fast. He looked utterly spent, wrecked, like he'd been in a war. And clenched gently in his mouth, held with a tenderness that belied his battered state, was his newest gift. It wasn't a feather. It wasn't a stone. It was a small, grubby, well-chewed child's pacifier. It was a style they didn't own. It was caked in dirt, but she could see its color was a faded, sugary pink. He looked up at her as the light came on, his green eyes glazed with fatigue. He made a weak, muffled sound around the pacifier in his mouth, a plea. Then, with the last of his strength, he nudged it forward with his nose, pushing it across the cool tile floor toward her feet. The offering. The message. The reason for his 2-day absence. And in that moment, Sarah's fear for her cat was completely eclipsed by a new, ice-cold terror that gripped her spine and refused to let go. This was no longer about a snake in the nursery. This was something else entirely. Something older. Something human. The mystery had just cracked wide open. The world shrank to the size of the mudroom tile, to the grubby pink pacifier lying between her bare feet and her battered breathing cat. Time didn't just stop. It shattered. Sarah's mind, foggy with sleep and fear, tried to process the image, but it kept breaking apart, refusing to form a coherent whole. A pacifier, a dirty, chewed, foreign pacifier, held by her cat who looked like he'd tunneled through the earth itself to bring it to her. Her first instinct was a mother's instinct. She dropped to her knees, her hands fluttering over Whisker's body, not touching, just assessing. "Oh, buddy. Oh, sweet boy. What happened to you?" Her voice was a thin, reedy thing, choked with tears. He was panting, his eyes half closed, with exhaustion, but he nudged the pacifier again with his nose, a desperate, insistent gesture. Look. See. Understand. The rational part of her brain, the part that had been sanded down by weeks of disbelief, tried to offer a pathetic explanation. He found it somewhere, in a neighbor's trash. He's just bringing home junk like he always does. But this was different. The feathers and stones were offerings. This was a report. This was evidence. The look in his eyes wasn't one of presentation. It was one of urgency, a frantic, tired urgency that had driven him for 2 days and left him broken on the floor. She reached for the pacifier. Her fingers, trembling violently, closed around the cold, gritty silicone. It felt wrong in her hand. Alien. She turned it over. There, etched into the plastic shield in faint, cursive letters, was a name. Lily. A cold that had nothing to do with the morning air seized her heart in a vice. Her breath hitched, a ragged, awful sound. This wasn't trash. This was a child's belonging. A specific child's, named, cherished. Lost. Whiskers made a weak sound, a mixture of a meow and a groan, and tried to push himself up. His legs trembled, buckling underneath him. He collapsed back onto the tile, but his head was up, his eyes fixed on her, willing her to move, to understand. He looked from her face to the back door, then back to her face. A clear, unmistakable command. "Follow! Mark!" The scream was torn from her throat, raw and primal. It wasn't a call. It was an alarm. A fracture in the universe, she heard. A thud from the bedroom. The sound of him falling out of bed, then his pounding footsteps down the hall. He skidded into the mudroom, his eyes wild with sleep and panic. What? What is it? Sarah? She couldn't form words. She just held out. The pacifier. Her hand shaking so badly it looked like she was offering him a live wire. Her other hand pointed a trembling finger at Whiskers, at his torn ear, his matted fur, his desperate, pleading eyes. Mark's gaze dropped to the pacifier, then to the cat. The sleep vanished from his face, replaced by a dawning, horrifying comprehension. He saw what she saw. This wasn't a random act, this was a mission. Holy shit, he breathed. He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to spook the already terrified animal. "Hey, big guy! Hey, where did you get this?" His voice was soft, but it vibrated with tension. Whiskers, as if in answer, used every ounce of strength he had left to drag his body a few inches toward the door. He let out another pitiful meow, this one cracking with strain. "He wants us to follow him," Sarah whispered, the truth of it solidifying in her gut, cold and heavy as stone. "Follow him where?" Mark asked, his voice rising. "Into the woods?" "Sarah, he's been gone for 2 days. He could have gone miles." "He brought this back," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of steel as she clutched the pacifier. "This isn't from miles away. This is from somewhere close, somewhere he knows we need to see." She looked at her husband, her eyes wide with a terror that was now fully formed, a terror for a child she didn't know. "Mark, a child named Lily is missing, and he knows where." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. It was the sound of a world tilting off its axis. It was the sound of the impossible becoming the only possible truth. They moved then, a frantic, synchronized ballet of purpose. There was no more discussion, no more doubt. The cat had spoken. They had to listen. Mark scooped Whiskers up as gently as he could, ignoring the dirt and grime that transferred to his pajamas. The cat didn't fight him. He went limp in his arms, his head lolling against Mark's chest, his job of alerting them finally done. Sarah yanked on a pair of muddy garden boots over her pajamas, not even bothering with a coat. She grabbed her phone, her fingers slipping on the password screen as she dialed 911. The same flat, digitally distant voice answered. 911. What is your emergency? I need to report a missing child, Sarah said, her voice shockingly clear and steady. Okay. Ma'am, what is the child's name? I don't know her last name. Her first name is Lily. I think she's very young. She uses a pacifier. The operator's tone shifted, becoming slightly more engaged, but still wary. Okay. And how do you know this child is missing? Sarah took a deep breath. This was it. The moment they would be called crazy again. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the weight of the pacifier in her hand and the weight of the cat in her husband's arms. Our cat brought us her pacifier. He's been gone for 2 days. He came back with it just now. He's hurt. He's trying to show us where she is. The pause on the other end of the line was long. Profoundly long. Sarah could practically hear the eye roll. Ma'am, your cat brought you a pacifier. Yes, and we're going to follow him, right now. We're going into the woods behind. Our house on Old Mill Road. Send someone, please. She didn't wait for a response. She ended the call and shoved the phone into her pocket. Mark had already shouldered open the back door, carrying Whiskers. The morning air was cold and sharp, tasting of dew and pine. The sky was a pale, watery gray, the sun just a suggestion behind the trees. Whiskers lifted his head in the fresh air, and he stirred in Mark's arms, looking toward the tree line. "Put him down," Sarah said. "Let him lead." Mark hesitated, looking at the cat-ragged state. "He can barely walk." "He'll show us," she insisted, a faith in her voice that was absolute. He didn't come this far to stop now. Gently, Mark set Whiskers down on the damp grass. The big cat stumbled, his legs wobbling. He took a few shaky steps, then stopped, his sides heaving. He looked back at them, his green eyes clouded with pain but burning with unmistakable purpose. "We're here, buddy," Mark said, his voice thick. "We're following. Just show us." It was all the encouragement Whiskers needed. He turned and began to move, not with his usual fluid grace, but with a determined, painful hobble. He didn't head for the well-worn path they sometimes walked on. He angled away from it, toward a thicker, more overgrown part of the woods where the underbrush was dense and thorny. They followed, crashing through brambles that snagged their pajamas and scratched their skin. They didn't speak. The only sounds were their ragged breathing, the snap of twigs underfoot, and the soft, dragging sound of Whiskers' body moving through the dead leaves. He was slow, so slow. Every few yards he'd pause, his body trembling, with the effort, and look back to make sure they were still there. The trust was a physical thing, a rope connecting them, pulling them deeper into the woods. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? Maybe a better question is, do we finally become open enough to see them when we're at our most desperate? When our own understanding fails, do we finally learn to listen to a different kind of language? A language of feathers and stones, and a dirty pacifier held in the mouth of a faithful friend? They walked for what felt like an eternity, though. It was probably only 15 minutes. The woods grew darker, the canopy thicker overhead. The world fell away. Their house, their jobs, the skeptical police. All of it vanished, leaving only this primal journey. Two humans following a wounded animal on a mission of mercy. Whiskers stopped suddenly at the base of a steep, rocky incline covered in a tangle of ivy and fallen logs. He looked up the slope, then back at them, and let out a weak, frustrated yowl. He couldn't climb it. Not in his condition. Mark didn't hesitate. "I'll go. Stay with him." He handed Sarah the flashlight from his phone and started to scramble up the rocks, grabbing onto roots and saplings for leverage. Sarah knelt beside Whiskers, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stroked his dirty fur, her touch gentle. "You did so good," she whispered, her tears falling freely now, spotting his fur. "You did so good, my brave boy. However this ends, you did good." He leaned into her touch, a faint, ragged purr starting in his chest. It was a sound of pure exhaustion, but also of relief. The burden was shared now. They heard Mark's voice from the top of the ridge, sharp with disbelief. "Sarah! Oh my God! Sarah!" "What? What is it?" she called up, her voice tight with fear. "There's an old well up here, boarded up." "Old well, and the boards, Jesus, the boards are broken." Time stopped again. The words old well and broken boards landed in her soul with the weight of 1,000 tombstones. Whiskers struggled to his feet beside her, his eyes fixed on the ridge, a new anxiety in his stance. Then, they heard it, faint but unmistakable, carried on the cold morning air from the top of the ridge. It was the sound of a child's weak, exhausted crying. The world exploded into motion. Sarah scrambled up the incline, her boots slipping on the wet rock, her hands torn by thorns. But she felt none of it. She hauled herself over the top and saw it, an old stone-ringed well, its wooden cover rotten with age. In the center of the cover, a section of boards had given way, splintered inward, leaving a dark, gaping hole just wide enough for a small body to fall through. Mark was on his stomach, his head and shoulders plunged into the opening, his voice echoing down into the darkness. Hey, hey, sweetheart, we're here. We're going to get you out. Can you look up at me? Can you see me? The crying from below intensified, a scared hiccuping sound that was the most beautiful and terrible thing Sarah had ever heard. She fell to her knees beside the well, peering down into the abyss. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. About 15 feet down, the shaft was blocked by a crisscross of fallen boards and debris that had caught the child's fall. And there, huddled on a precarious platform of rotten wood, was a little girl. She was maybe 2 years old, dressed in pink dinosaur pajamas that were filthy and torn. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt and tears, and clutched in her tiny hand was the matching, faded pink pacifier clip, its strap broken. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, and saw Sarah's face silhouetted against the morning sky. Whiskers had not just found a pacifier. He had found the child who had lost it. He had heard her cries for 2 days. He had tried to get to her, tearing at the earth, scratching at the well cover, hurting himself in the process, and when he couldn't do it alone, he had come back for them. He had brought the evidence. He had led them straight to her. The sound of sirens. Faint at first, then growing louder, cut through the woods. The police. The ones who hadn't believed them about the snake. They were coming now, because of the cat, because they had finally listened. Sarah looked down at the little girl, at this child named Lily, who had been living in a nightmare, and she started to talk, her voice a soft, steady lifeline she didn't know she possessed. "Hi, Lily. Hi, sweet girl. My name is Sarah. You're so brave. You've been so brave. We see you. We're right here. We're not going anywhere." Below, the little girl's cries softened to a whimper. Mark was already on the phone with 911 again, shouting their location, his voice cracking with adrenaline and relief. Sarah kept talking, a stream of comforting nonsense, her hand reaching down into the darkness as if she could somehow bridge the 15-foot gap with the force of her will. And as she did, she felt a movement beside her. Whiskers had somehow, miraculously, dragged his broken body up the steep incline. He stood at the edge of the well, his body trembling with the effort, and he peered down into the darkness at the crying child he had worked so desperately to save. He let out a soft, questioning sound. A gentle murrow? The little girl below stopped crying completely. She looked up, her eyes finding the cat. She made a small hiccuping sound. And then she did something that would be etched into Sarah's memory forever. She lifted her tiny, grimy hand, the one not clutching the pacifier clip, and reached up toward the cat. It was a gesture of pure, instinctual trust, a recognition. This was the creature who had been with her in the darkness. This was her furry guardian. Whiskers looked at the small hand reaching out from the depths of the well. He looked at Sarah, his green eyes holding a universe of unspoken understanding. And then, with infinite care, he stretched his own head and neck down over the precipice, over the terrifying drop, and he pressed the top of his head, softly, gently, against the tips of the little girl's outstretched fingers. It was the same gesture he had given Sarah in the nursery. The head press, the sign of trust. The cat's kiss. In that single, impossible, heart-stopping moment, hanging over the abyss, he completed his mission. He had found her. He had brought help. And now he was offering the only comfort he had left to give. A touch, a connection, a silent promise that she was not alone. The weight of it, the sheer staggering magnitude of his love and his purpose, finally broke Sarah completely. She sank onto the cold ground, her body racked with silent heaving sobs as the sirens wailed. Closer, and her husband shouted directions, and her cat comforted a lost child in a well. The disbelief was gone, burned away in the fierce, brilliant light of a truth that was, and would always be, undeniable. The sirens didn't just cut through the woods. They tore the morning apart. The quiet, sacred space around the well erupted into a chaos of flashing lights, shouted orders, and the heavy bootsteps of paramedics and firefighters crashing through the underbrush. For Sarah, kneeling in the dirt, it was all a blur of noise and movement happening at the end of a very long tunnel. Her whole world had narrowed to the circle of stone that was the well, to the tiny, pale face looking up from the darkness, and to the battered black and white cat who refused to leave his post at the rim. Hands tried to pull her back, a firefighter gently saying, "Ma'am, we need room to work." But she couldn't move. She was anchored there, her soul tethered to the scene below. She watched as they lowered a harness, as a rescuer was guided down, his voice a calm, steady murmur in the echoing shaft. She watched as he secured the little girl, Lily, wrapping her in a foil blanket that looked like a piece of starlight against the gloom. She saw the moment Lily was lifted free of the broken boards, her eyes squeezed shut, one small hand still clutching the paramedic's jacket, the other still holding that broken pacifier clip. A collective, held breath was released from everyone, on the surface as she emerged into the morning air, alive. She was whisked away, wrapped in warmth and professionalism, toward a waiting ambulance. Her parents, a couple Sarah would later learn had been frantic with terror for 48 hours, had been notified and were racing to the hospital. Their nightmare was ending. Their miracle had arrived. Delivered by a cat, through it all, Whiskers, did not move. Even as the uniforms swarmed around him, even as the noisy equipment was assembled, he remained at his vigil, his body slumped in utter exhaustion, but his head still raised, his eyes fixed on the well until the moment the child was out and safe. Only then did he finally lower his head onto his paws, his job truly, finally, done. The great vigil was over. The police officer who had once dismissed them about the snake was there. He stood off to the side, his earlier skepticism replaced by a look of stunned, bewildered reverence. He didn't approach them. He just watched Whiskers, as if trying to reconcile the aloof creature he'd barely glanced at weeks before with the four-legged savior now lying in the leaves. The rest of the day was a whirlwind they moved through in a daze. They gave their statements again and again, the story sounding less insane each time they told it, because the proof was now irrefutable. A child was alive. The cat was a hero. There were no more questions, only awed headshakes and murmured apologies. The weight of the disbelief that had pressed down on them for weeks finally lifted, leaving them feeling almost weightless, unmoored. They carried Whiskers home, the three of them. Mark held him cradled like a baby, and the cat, for the first time, didn't struggle. He was pliant, boneless with fatigue. They didn't put him in the mudroom. They brought him straight to their bathroom and ran a shallow, warm bath. Gently, they washed the 2 days of dirt and struggle from his fur, cleaning the small tear on his ear, wiping the grime from his white markings. He purred the entire time, a deep, rumbling motor of pure contentment, closing his eyes as their hands soothed and cleaned him. It was an act of baptism, a washing away of the old, transactional relationship. He was theirs, and they were his, utterly and completely. He slept for almost 24 hours straight, curled in a tight ball on their bed between them, one paw stretched out to touch Sarah's arm. They checked on him constantly, listening to the steady, reassuring sound of his breathing. The house, which had felt so empty without him, was now full again, but the silence was different. It was a peaceful, earned silence. The ghost of the snake was gone, banished not by bleach, but by a greater, more powerful magic. The story, of course, went viral. Hero Cat Saves Toddler from Well was a headline too irresistible to ignore. News vans parked on their quiet street for a week. Reporters shouted questions from the sidewalk. They were offered book deals, movie rights, a lifetime supply of cat food. They declined almost all of it. This wasn't a story they owned. It was Whiskers' story, and it was Lily's story. They gave one quiet interview together, sitting on their couch with Whiskers purring on the cushion between them, and that was it. They closed the door on the noise. They had what they needed. They had each other. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself, a softer, gentler rhythm. Mornings were still early, but the exhaustion was no longer a soul-crushing weight. It was just tiredness, the kind that could be fixed with coffee, and the sight of your daughter giggling as the cat she was now allowed to gently pat wove figure eights around her high-chair legs. Whiskers was different. The wildness in him, the aloofness, was gone. He had come home from his ordeal not just a hero, but a cat who had found his purpose and his family. He was, for lack of a better word, domesticated. He was a lap cat now. He'd hop up on the couch and curl into a contented loaf on Sarah's lap while she read, or he'd sprawl across Mark's chest while he watched TV, kneading his paws contentedly. He was a constant, purring presence in the nursery, often choosing to sleep not on the floor, but in the rocking chair. A furry, breathing guardian angel. The gifts stopped. He no longer brought them feathers or stones or pieces of glass. He had given them the only gift that mattered, and his work was done. His only job now was to purr. To accept the love they showered on him. They met Lily and her parents one afternoon in a park. It was a quiet, emotional meeting. Lily, a bright-eyed, energetic little girl with no memory of the terror in the well, was fascinated by the big kitty. She toddled over and, with a confidence that made everyone smile, patted his head. Whiskers, in turn, leaned into her small hand and gave it a slow, deliberate lick. Her parents, their eyes brimming with tears they couldn't shed, could only shake Mark and Sarah's hands over and over again, their gratitude a physical, overwhelming thing. "Thank you for listening to him," her mother whispered. "Thank you for believing." One afternoon, about a month after the well, Sarah was in the nursery. Chloe was down for her nap, and Whiskers was a soft black mound in the rocking chair. The room was peaceful, filled with golden afternoon light. Sarah was putting away laundry, her movements slow and calm. As she opened the top drawer of the dresser to put away Chloe's onesies, her hand brushed against the small ceramic bowl that held his old collection of treasures. The blue feather, the river stone, the dandelion head, now dry and fragile. She smiled, picking up the bowl. She'd leave it out for him, a little monument to their strange, beautiful history. As she went to set it on the dresser top, something caught her eye. Tucked behind the bowl, pushed back against the wall, was one last thing. Something he must have placed there days or weeks ago, in secret. A final gift. It was a single long barred feather from a hawk, brown and white and fierce-looking, and, carefully, deliberately wound around its shaft, again and again until it was secure, was a thin, faded piece of pink ribbon, the kind used for pacifier clips. Sarah's breath caught. She picked it up, her fingers trembling just as they had that morning in the mudroom. This was no random offering. This was a synthesis, a final report. It was the wild, fierce protector, the hawk, bound together with the vulnerable, cherished child, the pink ribbon. It was him. It was them. It was the story of what he had done and why he had done it, told in the only language he knew. She held it to her chest, tears streaming down her face, not out of sadness or fear, but from a sense of overwhelming, profound grace. She looked over at him, asleep in the chair. His sides rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He had given them everything. He had given a little girl back to her parents. He had given them back their sense of safety. He had given them a story of belief in a world full of doubt. And in the end, he had given them this last, perfect metaphor, a silent poem left in a drawer, ensuring they would never, ever forget. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet paw step in the hallway at 2 a.m. Sometimes it's a slow blink across a room. And sometimes it's a dirty pacifier carried home in the mouth of a friend, a silent scream that says, "Follow me, someone needs us. We are not alone." The storm had passed. The nights were less heavy. The mornings were lighter. And in the quiet heart of their home, a purr rumbled on, a constant, loving reminder that the most incredible truths are often found not in the words we shout, but in the quiet, faithful actions of those who love us. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If this felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.